The autumn of 1847 brought more than just golden leaves to the Wyoming Territory. It brought Thomas McKenna face to face with a destiny he never could have imagined, carried on the broad shoulders of a woman whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about strength, survival, and the thin line between civilization and the wild. Thomas had been tracking a wounded elk for 3 days when the storm hit. What started as a gentle drizzle quickly turned into a torrential downpour that swelled the Sweetwater River beyond recognition. The normally placid crossing had become a raging torrent of muddy water and debris, cutting off the wagon train's planned route and leaving Thomas stranded on the wrong side with a bullet wound in his thigh, courtesy of claim jumpers who'd tried to steal his horses 2 nights prior. As consciousness faded in and out, Thomas found himself wondering if this was how it would end, not in a blaze of glory defending his ranch, but bleeding out in the mud while the river roared its indifference to his fate. The fever had taken hold, and with it came visions that seemed too vivid to be mere hallucinations. He saw his father's disappointed face, heard his promised bride Sarah's gentle voice calling his name, felt the weight of expectations that had driven him west in the first place. But before we continue with Thomas's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these incredible tales of the American frontier to life, and we love hearing from our viewers around the world. It was in this delirium that she appeared, a figure so imposing that Thomas initially mistook her for a fever dream. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could have belonged to a lumberjack and arms thick as tree branches, the Shoshone woman emerged from the storm like something out of legend. Her name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her tongue, though there was nothing delicate about her appearance. Her face bore the weathered marks of someone who had faced down blizzards, bears, and the countless hardships of frontier life, yet her dark eyes held a gentleness that seemed to contradict her fearsome stature. Ayanna had been gathering medicinal herbs when she spotted the wounded white man. Her first instinct was to leave him. Her people had learned through bitter experience that helping settlers often brought nothing but trouble. But something in his fevered mumblings, the way he called out for his mother in his delirium, stirred a protective instinct she thought she'd buried long ago. Her own son had died of smallpox 3 winters past, brought by traders who promised friendship, but delivered only disease and sorrow. Without hesitation, she hoisted Thomas onto her back as if he weighed no more than a child. His 6-foot frame seemed almost fragile against her massive form as she waded into the churning river. The current fought her with every step, trying to tear them both into its hungry embrace, but Ayanna's legs were like oak trees, rooted and unshakable. She had crossed this river countless times in all seasons and conditions, but never with such precious cargo. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness during the crossing, aware only of the rhythmic motion of her powerful stride and the surprising gentleness with which she held him. In his fevered state, he imagined he was being carried by some benevolent spirit, a guardian angel sent to deliver him from the wilderness. The reality, he would soon learn, was far more complicated. The Shoshone village sat nestled in a valley protected from the worst of the storm's fury. As Ayanna carried Thomas through the circle of teepees, curious faces emerged from doorways. Children pointed and whispered, while elders exchanged meaningful glances. Everyone knew the law. It was as old as the tribe itself, carved into their collective memory through generations of storytelling and tradition. Chief Running Bear, a man whose wisdom was matched only by his adherence to tribal customs, watched as Ayanna laid the unconscious white man before the council fire. The flames danced across his weathered features as he spoke the words that would change 2 lives forever. She who carries another between the waters of life and the shadow of death claims that soul as her own. The river has witnessed. The spirits have blessed. Let it be recorded in the hearts of our people. Ayanna felt her stomach tighten as the familiar words echoed through the gathering. She had known this moment would come the instant she decided to save him, yet hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She had been alone for so long, her heart a fortress built from grief and disappointment. Now, by her own actions, she had bound herself to a stranger whose world was as foreign to her as hers would be to him. Thomas awoke 3 days later to find himself in a teepee that smelled of sage and wood smoke, his wound cleaned and bandaged with a skill that impressed even his frontier-hardened sensibilities. The woman sitting beside him was so large that she seemed to fill the entire space, yet her movements as she tended to him were surprisingly graceful. When their eyes met, he saw intelligence there, and something else, a vulnerability that her imposing frame couldn't quite hide. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse from fever and disuse. Ayana nodded, understanding his English better than she could speak it. "River angry," she said carefully, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "You almost go to spirits." It was then that Chief Running Bear entered, accompanied by the tribal interpreter, a mixed-blood man named Joseph, who had learned English from missionaries. What followed was a conversation that would have been comical if it weren't so serious. Joseph explained the tribal law, the binding nature of Ayana's rescue, and the expectations that now fell upon both of them. Thomas listened in growing amazement and horror. Married? To this giant of a woman? He thought of Sarah waiting for him back in Missouri, of the small ranch he'd been building with his own hands, of the life he'd planned that had no room for such complications. Yet as he looked at Ayana, seeing the way she avoided his gaze, the proud set of her shoulders that couldn't quite hide her uncertainty, he felt something unexpected. Not attraction exactly, but a recognition of shared loneliness. "What if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Joseph translated the question, and Chief Running Bear's response came swift and final. "He says you are free to leave, but you will leave as you came, with nothing. The clothes on your back, the life in your body, these are gifts from Ayana. To reject the marriage is to reject the gifts, and the spirits do not look kindly on such ingratitude." Thomas found himself studying Ayana more closely. Beneath the intimidating exterior, he began to notice details that spoke of a different story. Her hands, though large and calloused, moved with surprising delicacy when she prepared his medicine. Her voice, when she hummed while working, carried a melody that spoke of deep sadness and deeper strength. She was, he realized, as trapped by this situation as he was, bound by laws and customs that neither of them had chosen, but both were expected to honor. The days that followed were awkward beyond description. Ayana moved through her daily routines with Thomas as a constant, bewildered observer. He watched her hunt with a bow that would have required two normal men to draw, saw her gentle way with the village children who climbed on her like she was a living mountain, witnessed her skill at crafts that required the finest motor control despite her massive fingers. Slowly, Thomas began to understand that Ayana's size was not just unusual, it was miraculous. In a world where physical strength often meant the difference between life and death, she was a force of nature wrapped in human form. Yet she carried herself with the careful restraint of someone who had learned early that her power could frighten as easily as it could protect. For her part, Ayana found herself studying this white man who had fallen into her life like a stone dropped into still water. He was smaller than the men of her tribe, but there was a wiry strength to him that spoke of hard work and harder choices. His hands bore the calluses of someone who built things, created rather than just destroyed. When he looked at her, she saw wariness. Yes, but also a growing curiosity that gave her hope. The breakthrough came during Thomas's second week in the village. A group of young warriors, emboldened by whiskey traded from passing merchants, decided to test the white man's courage. They surrounded him near the river, speaking in rapid Shoshone that he couldn't understand but whose hostile intent was unmistakable. Thomas stood his ground, his hand moving instinctively toward where his gun would have been if he still had one. It was then that Ayana appeared, moving with surprising speed for someone of her size. She didn't say a word, simply placed herself between Thomas and the warriors. The young men, brave enough to face down a lone white man, suddenly found their courage evaporating in the face of Ayana's quiet fury. She spoke to them in low, measured tones that carried the weight of absolute authority. Whatever she said sent them slinking away like chastened children. "Thank you," Thomas said when they were alone. Ayana turned to him, and for the first time since his arrival she smiled. It transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth that her serious expression had hidden. "You, my husband," she said carefully. "I protect." It was a simple statement, but it carried implications that Thomas was only beginning to understand. In her world, marriage wasn't just about love or even companionship. It was about survival, about two people choosing to face the world's dangers together, rather than alone. She had claimed him not out of desire, but out of duty, and now that duty extended to protecting him from all threats, even those within her own tribe. That night, as they sat by their fire, Thomas found himself really talking to Ayana for the first time. Her English was limited, but her intelligence was not, and between words, gestures, and the occasional translation from Joseph, they began to build the foundation of understanding. Thomas learned that Ayanna had been born different, larger than any woman in tribal memory. Her size had made her valuable as a warrior and hunter, but it had also isolated her from the normal rhythms of courtship and family life. Men were intimidated by her strength, women uncertain how to relate to someone so far outside their experience. She had married once, to a man brave enough to see past her unusual stature, but he had died in a hunting accident, leaving her with a son who became the center of her world, until smallpox took him too. In return, Thomas shared his own story, the pressure from his father to make something of himself, the promise to marry Sarah that had been more about family alliances than love, the dream of building something lasting in a land that seemed determined to tear down everything humans tried to create. He spoke of his fears, his sense of never being quite enough for the expectations placed upon him, and his growing realization that the life he'd planned might not be the life he actually wanted. As autumn deepened into winter, an unexpected companionship began to grow between them. Thomas discovered that Ayanna had a quick wit and a dry sense of humor that transcended language barriers. She, in turn, found that Thomas treated her not as a curiosity or a threat, but as a person worthy of respect and consideration. They developed routines, small rituals of daily life that began to feel natural rather than forced. Thomas taught Ayanna to read English, using a worn Bible that had survived his river crossing. She proved to be a quick student, her large fingers surprisingly adept at forming letters on bark with charcoal. In return, she taught him the ways of her people, how to read weather signs, how to move silently through the forest, how to find food and medicine in the wilderness. But even as their relationship deepened, both carried the weight of unfinished business. Thomas's ranch waited for him across the mountains, along with Sarah and her father, who had invested heavily in Thomas's success and would not take kindly to his abandonment of their arrangement. Ayanna, meanwhile, faced growing pressure from some tribal members who saw her marriage to a white man as a betrayal of their people's interests. The crisis came with the spring thaw. A group of armed men arrived at the village, led by Sarah's father, Colonel William Hartwell, and accompanied by a federal marshal. They had come to retrieve Thomas and to deliver an ultimatum: return to fulfill his obligations or face charges of theft and breach of contract. The horses and supplies that had financed his western venture belonged to Hartwell, and the colonel intended to collect on his investment one way or another. Thomas found himself caught between two worlds, two sets of obligations that seemed impossible to reconcile. On one side stood Ayanna, representing a life he had never planned, but had come to value more than he'd expected. On the other stood Sarah, sweet and gentle and everything a proper wife should be, along with the security and respectability that marriage to her would bring. The confrontation took place in the village center, with the entire tribe gathered to witness. Colonel Hartwell was a man accustomed to getting his way, and he made his position clear with military precision. "McKenna, you have obligations. Sarah has waited faithfully for your return, and I have invested considerable resources in your success. This arrangement," he gestured dismissively at Ayanna, "is not legally binding. You will return with us, fulfill your commitments, and put this unfortunate episode behind you." Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing the careful mask she had pulled over her features. She stood straight and proud, but he could read the pain in her eyes, the resignation of someone who had learned not to expect happiness to last. In that moment, he realized that his choice wasn't really between two women. It was between two versions of himself. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Colonel," Thomas said carefully, "but I can't return. My place is here now." The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He hadn't planned to refuse, hadn't even been certain of his decision until the moment it was required. But looking at Ayanna, seeing the way her carefully controlled expression flickered with hope, he knew he had chosen correctly. Colonel Hartwell's face darkened with rage. "You ungrateful fool. Do you think you can simply walk away from your obligations? I'll see you in prison before I let you make a mockery of my family's honor." It was then that Chief Running Bear stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. Through Joseph, he delivered a message that would echo through the territory for years to come. "Tell the soldier chief that this man is now Shoshone. He has been claimed by our laws, blessed by our spirits, and accepted by our people. Any attempt to take him by force will be considered an act of war." The standoff that followed was tense beyond description. Hartwell had brought 20 armed men, but the entire Shoshone village had quietly mobilized around them. Warriors emerged from concealment, their weapons ready, but not yet raised. Women and children moved to positions of safety, but their eyes remained fixed on the confrontation, ready to support their people if violence erupted. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. His choice had consequences that extended far beyond his personal happiness. If this escalated into violence, people would die because of his decision to stay. Yet as he looked around the village, seeing the faces of people who had accepted him despite his differences, he knew he couldn't abandon them any more than he could abandon Ayanna. The tension was broken by an unexpected voice. Sarah herself stepped forward, having remained silent throughout the confrontation. She was everything Thomas remembered, petite, blonde, with the kind of delicate beauty that frontier life often destroyed but had somehow left untouched. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that surprised everyone present. "Father, stop this," she said firmly. "Look at him. Really, look at him. When did you last see Thomas smile the way he did when he looked at her? When did you last see him stand so straight, so certain of his place in the world?" Colonel Hartwell stared at his daughter in shock. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're saying. This savage has bewitched him somehow. We can't simply—" "She's not a savage, Father. She's a woman who saved the man I was supposed to marry, and in doing so showed me something I was too afraid to admit to myself." Sarah turned to Thomas, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her voice steady. "I never loved you, Thomas. I cared for you, respected you, but I never loved you. I was too much of a coward to say so before, but seeing you now, seeing how you look at her, I can't be the reason you give up the first real happiness you've ever found." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Thomas felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and sorrow for the pain he could see in Sarah's eyes despite her brave words. Colonel Hartwell looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. But the crisis was far from over. Even as the immediate threat of violence receded, a new danger was approaching from the east. A group of land speculators backed by railroad interests and territorial politicians had been systematically driving native tribes from their traditional lands. They had heard about the confrontation at the Shoshone village and saw an opportunity to eliminate what they viewed as an obstacle to progress. The attack came at dawn 3 days later. 50 armed men calling themselves the Wyoming Territory Development Company surrounded the village with the intention of forcing the tribe to relocate to a reservation hundreds of miles away. Their leader, a man named Silas Crenshaw, had made his fortune displacing native peoples and selling their lands to railroad companies. He saw the Shoshone village as just another obstacle to be removed. Thomas awoke to the sound of gunfire and shouting. Through the teepee's entrance, he could see muzzle flashes in the pre-dawn darkness and hear the screams of frightened horses and children. Ayanna was already moving, her massive frame flowing with surprising grace as she gathered weapons and prepared for battle. "Stay here," she commanded, her English suddenly much clearer under the pressure of crisis. "Protect children." But Thomas had no intention of hiding while the people who had accepted him fought for their lives. He grabbed a rifle from among the weapons Ayanna had gathered and followed her into the chaos outside. What he saw there would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The attackers had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the village, using the cover of darkness and superior firepower to pin down the Shoshone defenders. They weren't trying to minimize casualties. Quite the opposite. Crenshaw's strategy was to make the cost of resistance so high that other tribes would surrender without a fight. Thomas found himself fighting alongside warriors who had been strangers just months before, but who now treated him as a brother. His marksmanship, honed by years of hunting on the frontier, proved invaluable in the desperate defense. But it was Ayanna who truly turned the tide of battle. Moving through the fighting like an avenging spirit, she wielded a war club that few men could have lifted, let alone swung with deadly precision. Her size, which had once made her an object of curiosity and sometimes fear, now became a weapon in itself. Attackers who had expected to face typical native resistance found themselves confronting a force of nature that seemed to shrug off bullets and deal death with every swing of her massive arms. Thomas watched in awe and terror as his wife, for he now thought of her truly as his wife, carved a path through the enemy ranks. She moved to protect the village's children and elders, her body serving as a living shield against the attackers' bullets. When a group of gunmen tried to flank the village's main defensive position, Ayanna appeared among them like a nightmare made flesh, her war club rising and falling with mechanical precision. But even her incredible strength couldn't be everywhere at once. Thomas saw a group of attackers moving toward the teepee where the village's wounded had been gathered, including several children too young to flee. Without thinking, he broke from his position and ran to intercept them, his rifle barking as he moved. The fight that followed was brief, but vicious. Thomas managed to drop 2 of the attackers before his rifle ran empty, then found himself facing 3 armed men with nothing but a knife. He was fast, but they were faster, and he felt the burn of a bullet crease his ribs just as Ayanna's war cry echoed across the battlefield. She appeared behind the attackers like a force of nature, her club crushing the first man's skull before the others could turn. The second managed to get his gun around, but Ayanna's free hand caught his wrist and twisted with a sound like breaking kindling. The third man, seeing his companions fall, turned to run, but Ayanna's thrown knife took him between the shoulder blades before he'd gone 3 steps. As dawn broke fully over the battlefield, the surviving attackers began to retreat. Crenshaw's superior numbers and firepower had proven insufficient against the combination of Shoshone courage, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the unexpected presence of a giant woman who fought like 10 warriors. The development company had lost nearly half their men, while the village's casualties, though significant, were far lighter than they might have been. Thomas found himself sitting beside the village's central fire, his wound bandaged and his mind struggling to process what he had experienced. He had fought in battles before, but never for something that felt so fundamentally right. These people, this place, this woman who had claimed him, they had become worth dying for in a way that his previous life had never been. Ayanna sat beside him, her own wounds being tended by the village healer. She had taken 3 bullets during the fighting, but her incredible constitution had kept her on her feet throughout the battle. Now, in the aftermath, Thomas could see the exhaustion and pain she had hidden during the crisis. "You fought well," she said, her English now flowing more smoothly than he had ever heard it. Like true Shoshone warrior. Thomas looked at her in surprise. "You're English. You've been holding back." Ayanna smiled, an expression that transformed her battle-scarred features. "Easier to listen when people think you not understand. Learn much about white man's heart that way." It was then that Thomas realized the full extent of what had happened between them. She had been testing him all along, watching to see what kind of man he truly was beneath the surface. The language barrier had been partly real, partly a shield that allowed her to observe without being observed in return. "And what did you learn about my heart?" he asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face. "Learn that you see Ayanna, not just big woman. Learn that you stay when easier to go. Learn that you fight for people, not your blood, not your tribe." She paused, then added softly, "Learn that maybe spirits know what they do when they bring you to river." The weeks that followed brought a strange kind of peace to the valley. Word of the failed attack spread quickly through the territory, and other would-be land grabbers decided to look for easier targets. The federal government, embarrassed by the unauthorized assault on a peaceful tribe, officially censured the Wyoming Territory Development Company and promised to investigate their activities. Colonel Hartwell and Sarah had departed after the battle, but not before Sarah had a final conversation with Thomas. She had watched him during the fighting, seen the way he moved to protect people he barely knew, witnessed the partnership between him and Ayanna that went far beyond mere marriage. "I was wrong about her," Sarah admitted as she prepared to leave. "And I was wrong about what you needed. You were never meant for drawing rooms and tea parties. Thomas, you were meant for this, for a life that matters with a woman strong enough to stand beside you in it." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Sarah's blessing meant more to him than he could express, not because he needed her permission, but because it confirmed what he had come to believe about his choice. As summer arrived in the valley, Thomas and Ayanna settled into a rhythm of life that felt as natural as breathing. They built a cabin together, combining his knowledge of construction with her understanding of the land and climate. The structure that emerged was unlike anything either culture might have built alone. Part log cabin, part lodge, designed to accommodate Ayanna's size while incorporating the practical elements Thomas had learned from frontier living. Their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. Physical intimacy had come slowly, built on growing trust and genuine affection rather than mere obligation. Thomas discovered that Ayana's size, which had initially intimidated him, brought with it a capacity for gentleness that smaller people often lacked. She had learned to control her strength so precisely that she could handle the most delicate tasks, and that same control extended to every aspect of their relationship. For her part, Ayana found in Thomas a partner who valued her mind as much as her strength. He consulted her on decisions, sought her advice on matters both practical and personal, and never once suggested that her opinions mattered less because of her gender or her heritage. In a world where women, especially Native women, were often treated as property or curiosities, Thomas's respect for her intelligence and judgment was a gift beyond price. The village prospered under their combined influence. Thomas's knowledge of white man's ways proved invaluable in dealing with traders and government officials, while Ayana's status as a respected warrior and his wife gave him credibility within the tribe that no outsider could normally achieve. They became a bridge between two worlds, helping to negotiate agreements that benefited both sides. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The man who had once worried constantly about living up to other people's expectations had found a place where his worth was measured not by what others thought he should be, but by what he actually contributed. He had discovered that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. One evening, as they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Ayana placed her large hand over his smaller one. "You happy?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the contentment in his eyes. Thomas considered the question seriously, thinking about the life he had left behind and the one he had found. "More than I ever thought possible," he said finally. "I spent so many years trying to be what other people wanted me to be, that I forgot to figure out who I actually was." Ayana nodded, understanding completely. Spirits bring us together for reason, not just to save your life, but to save both our hearts. As if summoned by their words, Chief Running Bear approached their cabin, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Through Joseph, who had become a frequent visitor and friend, he delivered news that would cement their place in tribal history. "The chief says that the council has decided to record your story in the winter tellings," Joseph translated. "It will be passed down through the generations as an example of how the spirits work through unexpected means to bring about necessary changes." Thomas felt a deep sense of honor at the announcement. To have their story become part of the tribe's oral tradition was a recognition that went far beyond mere acceptance. It was immortality of a sort, ensuring that future generations would know about the white man who chose love over obligation and the giant woman who saved more than just his life. But even as they celebrated this honor, both Thomas and Ayana knew that their story was far from over. The frontier was changing rapidly, with railroads and settlements pushing ever westward. The peaceful valley that had become their sanctuary would not remain isolated forever, and they would need to find ways to protect their people and their way of life in an increasingly complex world. Yet as they faced an uncertain future, they did so together, bound not just by tribal law or social convention, but by a love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. Thomas had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures came not from seeking them out, but from being open to the unexpected paths that life presented. And Ayana had discovered that strength came in many forms. Sometimes it meant carrying a wounded stranger across a raging river, and sometimes it meant opening your heart to the possibility of love when you thought that part of your life was over. The river that had brought them together continued to flow past their cabin, its voice a constant reminder of the moment when two lives had intersected and changed forever. In its waters, they could see the reflection of their shared future, uncertain perhaps, but faced together with the kind of courage that comes only from knowing you have found your true place in the world. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Thomas and Ayana sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by the invisible bonds that had grown between them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove themselves worthy of the trust their people had placed in them. But tonight, they were simply a man and a woman who had found each other against all odds, in a land where love was often the only law that truly mattered. The story of Thomas McKenna and Ayana would indeed be told around winter fires for generations to come, but not as a tale of obligation fulfilled or duty discharged. Instead, it would be remembered as proof that sometimes the spirits know exactly what they're doing when they bring two unlikely souls together at the edge of a raging river, in a moment when everything hangs in the balance between life and death, between the familiar and the unknown, between the person you were and the person you were always meant to become. In the end, Thomas had found something more valuable than gold or land or social standing. He had found a home not just in a place, but in the heart of a woman whose strength matched his own courage, whose wisdom complemented his determination, and whose love had transformed them both into something greater than either could have been alone. And in that transformation, they had become living proof that the greatest adventures often begin not with a journey into the unknown, but with the courage to let the unknown journey into you.